the rates in small communities really should be significantly more than the rates in large cities. It's economies of scale. We don't have enough people to spread the cost out over, but there's a minimum cost of running a water utility or a wastewater utility, especially on the infrastructure side. But I think what we end up finding is that a lot of these small communities, they do enough to stay in compliance. The people who work there are wonderful, and they can manage to do a lot with a little. And I don't want to speak disparagingly of them in any way, shape, or form. They're real heroes in their communities. They're keeping the utility just going. And they're all one natural disaster or public health crisis away from a really big problem.
Welcome to the Make Water Work podcast, where we dive into the people, ideas, and innovations shaping the future of water. I'm your host, Isaac Pellerin, and alongside my co-host, Megan Glover, the founder of 120 Water, we bring you insights from hundreds of incredible conversations we've had over the past 9 years with inspiring and energizing leaders in the water industry. Each week, we share those stories and conversations with entrepreneurs, community champions, and innovators who are making water work for everyone. Whether you're a water professional, a curious innovator, or simply passionate about our most precious resource, this podcast is for you. Let's get started.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Make Water Work podcast, where Isaac and I are speaking to the water professionals that are innovating and making water work every single day. So who are we celebrating today, Isaac?
You know, today we get to talk to someone who I've known for quite a while, and both of us have known for quite a while. His name is Glenn Barnes, and Glenn really works at the intersection of affordability. How do utilities update their critical infrastructure while still maintaining the importance of affordability for communities? And so it's a big topic. It's a big problem. We're always talking to utilities and regulators and states about how do you fund this? And it's not easy. So you need people who know how to navigate the challenges of funding because this is mission critical. So, Glenn, we are so excited to welcome you to this podcast, and welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, and as we've done this podcast, and as we've navigated interacting with folks all across the water industry, we've never run into anyone who didn't have a story about how water found them. And so we love starting this podcast just asking, how did water find you?
And I think it's really a good question of how it found me, because I think that's more accurate than saying I found it, as I think is true for many people. When I was an undergraduate, I was an English major, and I was convinced that I wanted to be a literature professor, like, the tweed jacket and pipe and whole 9 yards, and was ready to go and get my PhD, but decided I just wanted a year off before I continued on with my studies. And I started working for an environmental nonprofit. Had nothing to do with water. It was more lobbying and policy work, and I was working around energy and public health, and really enjoyed the work. So I stayed a second year, and then a third year, and a fourth year, and eventually, after 7 years of doing that kind of work, and I was largely on the development side, so fundraising side for these various organizations, I thought, I'd like to run a nonprofit someday, but I don't really know how to do that. My literature degree didn't entirely prepare me for that. So I decided to get a Master of Public Administration degree. And when I got to grad school, they said, well, we need to give you a research assistantship, and you have environmental background, so we're going to put you with this group called the Environmental Finance Center. And they are a group that does quite a lot of work with water. And I started there as a graduate student. That turned into a full-time gig that I stayed with for 12 years before leaving and founding Water Finance Assistance back in 2019. And initially within that group, they did water, wastewater, stormwater, wetlands, energy, air quality. I was doing almost everything but water. Everybody else was heavily water focused. I was more in the other environmental areas. But in 2012, the Environmental Finance Center Network applied for some EPA funding to do a training and technical assistance program for small communities. And they took a look at this project and said, well, this is going to be a lot of training and a lot of travel. And Glenn, you like traveling and giving workshops, so you should lead this project nationally. And so I got tapped to do that, even though I had the least water experience in the office. We ended up winning the funding, and I ran that program with my wonderful colleague, Heather Himmelberger from the Southwest Environmental Finance Center for many years. And that's really where I got deeply into water.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad water found you, Glenn, because you are literally on the forefront helping communities, oftentimes of maybe some of the greatest need, find financing either within their own rate base and optimizing that, but also kind of external sources. So for those listening who may not understand how funding works or the gap that potentially our water industry is facing right now, can you just do a state of water funding 101 for the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really great question, because it's important to understand the funding model that water and wastewater have, especially when they're run by governments, because we tend to think that if something is run by the government, it's paid for by taxes. But in fact, that's not the case with water and wastewater. So they are what are known as enterprise funds. And that means that they are responsible for generating their own revenue to cover their own expenses. And typically that is done through charging customers for the water that they receive. And then there are some other, if you're connecting a new customer, that's going to be a little bit of source of revenue. If you're selling water to another community, that might be another source of revenue. But by and large, the money that utilities get come from their customer base.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's the ideal model. The reality is that when the Safe Drinking Water Act and Clean Water Act were passed in the 1970s, the federal government had a number of grant programs to help communities get up to speed on these new federal regulations. And so this big expense that water and wastewater have of paying for all of the pipes and treatment plants and tanks and towers and pumps and motors that they have, they basically got a check from the federal government paid for by taxpayers around the country to put in that infrastructure, and they did not have to pay that money back. Then, as communities have expanded, and many communities in the United States have expanded, they would say, okay, we're putting in 100 new homes in town, and we're going to ask the developer to actually pay to extend the water and wastewater infrastructure into that community.
Mm-hmm.
So the developer pays for that and then essentially rolls that cost into the price of the homes that are being sold.
Yeah.
So we're paying rates to water utilities, but we're also in the past paid for some of the infrastructure through our federal tax dollars. And then also some of us have paid for the water infrastructure through our mortgages without even realizing it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're now to a point that those federal grants are largely long gone. They've been replaced by low interest loans, which is still a cost savings to utilities. And that development in communities is only paying for the new water lines.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all this infrastructure that went in the 1970s is reaching a point where it needs to be replaced.
Yeah.
And so for the first time, we're at a point where we as water consumers are actually going to start to pay for the entire cost of the utility to actually become a true enterprise fund. And what that has meant, unfortunately, is that water rates that have really been artificially low for decades are now climbing much more rapidly than they have in the past. And in fact, are often climbing higher or faster than the rates of other utilities.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. I remember when we bought our first house in Indianapolis, and we were still on a septic system. And I remember our corridor was going to be connected to the municipal sewer system all the time we were there. And I mean, we were making nothing at any. We were just getting starting our careers. We had no money, but everyone in our neighborhood kept saying, make sure you budget for it because it's going to cost about $5,000 to connect to your municipal sewer system. And I remember thinking, wait, hold on a minute. I have to come out of pocket to connect to the sewer system that then I have to start paying for. Like, how does this work? Isn't this just a municipal service, Glenn, that I'm entitled to once I'm connected to it? How often do you hear that? And how much of that do you think is, education or, so on and so forth?
Yeah, I hear it a lot. I think, I know all these nitty gritty details because I literally have a master's degree in how to run local governments. And I think there's people within that program that don't necessarily understand these nuances as well. But I think, Megan, the truth is we chose to make water and wastewater a utility. We could have also chosen to make it a public service like police and fire that is paid for out of taxes. But we did not make that choice. We have chosen to make it something that is customer supported and fee supported.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of arguments as to why that's the right way to do things, because if I'm very frugal with my water use and somebody else is very wasteful, it seems fair that I should pay less than they do. But people, they don't necessarily understand the difference between, say, public schools and public safety and public water supply. They just get this bill.
That's right.
And as you said, when there is a capital improvement to be done, and that's often the most expensive part of running a utility, is replacing these multi-million-dollar assets, which, by the way, are still multi-million dollars if your community is 150 people.
Right.
Let alone a large city.
Point. Yes.
In Indianapolis, you can spread the cost out over a large number of customers. Phoenix, it's the same thing. But I work in really tiny communities that have, 100 connections. And if they have a $2 million piece of infrastructure to put in there, that's going to be really expensive, even if they're getting a long-term loan to pay for that cost. Whereas, again, 50 years ago, a community of that size probably just got a check to go out and buy the infrastructure, and then they didn't have to worry about paying it back.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
It's such an interesting distinction, too, that you made, because I think even for myself, what I'm learning in this very moment is just that I do have a mindset that it's a public service, just like fire department, just like police department. It's such a tough mindset to say that when I live somewhere, my community has these services, and that just comes from my taxes.
Yeah.
So it's understanding. I'm having an aha moment. Sorry. Coming back. No, but it's just like that's such a difficult paradigm shift to make in the mind of the public, to say, oh, this is different than these other things. So the reactions to rates increasing or those kind of things kind of make sense. That's like, I didn't see that coming. Why doesn't it work the way everything else works?
And yet at the same time, I think in our modern society, you need electricity to be able to survive and thrive. You need some type of heating source. Really, I think internet is becoming more of a necessity than a nice to have. And I think we certainly saw that with COVID and schools, for example, moving online. And so there are plenty of other examples of utility services that we need. Now, you're going to die more quickly without water than any of those others. That's definitely true. But I think that there are other parts of our society where there are things that we really need to function that are set up this way in utilities. And I think unlike those other examples of electricity and natural gas or heating oil or internet, by and large, more people are served by a government-owned utility in the United States, whereas the other utility services tend to be privately owned. Now, of course, we do have privately owned water utilities as well.
Yeah. So Glenn, you mentioned we've got, so when you think about how the utility pays its bills and produces its product, which is clean and reliable drinking and wastewater and sewer services, right? We have the rate base. You keep talking about these loans, right? So maybe describe for us where are the sources of these loans, and are the monies readily available? What's the barrier to access these loans? Is it enough? Unpack the loans that you're kind of speaking of for a minute to kind of help us understand the accessibility of capital in our water space.
Absolutely. So a utility, if it needs to borrow money to, say, put in a piece of infrastructure that's going to cost a couple $1 million, they could walk down the street to a bank in the community, just like you or I could if we need to make an improvement on our house or start a business, and fill out the paperwork and take out a loan. That happens very rarely, but it could happen. Larger communities will also go to the bond market. So they will look to get a group of investors to loan them money with a guaranteed rate of return on those dollars. But that's something that small to medium-sized communities are often not going to be able to access the bond market very easily. That's a very complicated, long, expensive process that I understand about this much of. So I won't go into much detail other than to say, typically you're going to be talking about your larger cities are dealing with the bond market. For most communities, if they need to borrow money, they're going to look at a government sponsored program. And so probably the two largest ones to talk about are, on the one hand, the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds. And then on the other hand, a loan program offered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So let me start with the state revolving funds, or sometimes our acronym happy industry calls it the SRF programs. So what happens with these programs is the federal government every year allocates a chunk of money to their state partners, territorial partners as well, but state partners, to then seed a revolving loan fund. So that money is loaned out then to communities for water infrastructure. And each state has a scoring criteria that they look at. You bring them an application that says we need to build a water tower and here's why, and they'll score that application and the top scorers get the loans. And then as that money is repaid to the state then takes those repayments and loans that money out to the next borrower in need.
Yeah.
So they're meant to be set up as self-sustaining programs, but they do get an infusion of federal money every year. Well, so far they've been getting a federal infusion every year. That's not a guarantee.
Yeah.
Then for smaller communities, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, the same USDA, by the way, that does beef inspection and all of that kind of thing. We think of them, they're like the steak people, right? Well, they're really about community and economic development in rural America. And so if you're under 10,000 people served, you are eligible to apply for funding from USDA. And the advantage of that is that is a program that is specifically targeting those smaller communities that sometimes would have a more difficult time competing for the state revolving fund loans. Now, the two big exciting things that have been happening in the last couple of years, one is the bipartisan infrastructure law, or the Infrastructure Investment and Job Acts, IIJA, or bill in our acronym heavy industry again, which are both terrible. This basically just dumped a ton of extra money into these programs, as well as created some special pots of money for lead service line replacement and for PFAS. So that has brought extra dollars to the table, which is exciting. But then on the other hand, as Congress, for about a 10-year period, stopped doing what are known as earmarks or congressionally directed spending, or pork, if you would prefer. But essentially, where a member of Congress is going to say, I'm going to write a law that says this town in my district is going to get $2 million for a water project. Well, a couple of years ago, they brought that back. And, this is the grease that makes Congress work. I don't think we're always happy to hear that, but like, Congress works better when you can trade somebody a project in their district for their vote on something. And that's just the way it is. But this congressionally directed spending is essentially a grant that does not have to be repaid. And people in the water sector thought, this is great, right? We're going to get some projects paid for. The problem is that Congress deducts the amount of that earmark from that pot of money it gives to the states for the state revolving fund every year. And now, instead of going with the state's criteria of whether a project is worthy or not, it often comes down to, is this particular community well connected with their member of Congress?
Yes.
And so that all of a sudden creates a funding gap. So one of my questions is like, what are the other, in the work that you do, like what are the other funding sources that communities then turn to try to make up when they're like, if SRF is already earmarked and spoken for, but there are still needs, like how do they navigate that type of financing situation?
This is a big problem. And you talk about the funding gap. So every couple of years, EPA assesses the amount of capital projects needed over the next 20 years in the water sector and in the wastewater sector. It's hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe even trillions of dollars at this point. I don't remember the number off the top of my head. But the bipartisan infrastructure law, the largest infrastructure bill we've seen in our lifetimes, was, forgive the pun, a drop in the bucket compared to this 20-year need. And so I often think what's happening is some of these communities are trying to find another source of money. Maybe they are trying to go to the bond market. Some states are coming up with their own dollars to supplement the federal money, or they're helping smaller communities by aggregating projects into a single bond offering. You see a lot of creativeness, but the biggest thing that's happening is they're delaying doing projects.
Right.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is, number one, it's always cheaper to replace an asset proactively than reactively. So if you know that this tank is vital for providing service to your community, you really want to replace it before it has a complete failure, or your whole community might be facing no water, or if it's a treatment plant, say a dangerous situation with the water. It's never a good idea to delay. You're threatening public health, but most likely that project will now be more expensive in a couple of years when the money is available. So I know y'all had my buddy George Hawkins on this series already. George and I were at a conference together maybe about 5 years ago, and I remember his quote was something like, the bipartisan infrastructure law is more money than we have ever seen, but it is not enough. And I think that level of investment either needs to keep coming, or utilities are going to have to start to use these private lending options more than they have in the past.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I've been developing a hypothesis, because you mentioned that the EPA looks at and estimates what it would cost to update our infrastructure. I think they're doing that with inadequate data. Like, I don't know that they have a really robust, standardized way of assessing the criticality of assets, what it costs to replace. I think the fidelity of that data could get a lot better. Mm-hmm. And I've been wondering if there's a play in the next 1 or 2 election cycles to really make a push for another infrastructure bill that's more addressing criticality of assets more than it is water quality. Like, so much in the last one was around lead and PFAS and water quality. I'm curious from your perspective, like how that criticality of assets, the asset management plans, how do those look for communities? And I guess I'm looking for your reaction on like, does that check out? It's a working theory, but yeah.
There's two issues here, Isaac. So the first is, I think you're right. The way that EPA does this is a survey. And there are ways, I remember from my graduate school days that you can come up with a representative sample of utilities and you can extrapolate out from there, but you are extrapolating. Right. You're not literally asking every community, what do you need? The problem is, if you were to do that, the answer that most communities would give, because most utilities are small utilities, is we don't know.
Yep.
Because they're not doing asset management, they don't have a good grasp on that, and they are being, unfortunately, more reactive when disasters happen to replacing infrastructure. So I think you're 100% right that we don't have the data that we need, nor do I think the data that we need actually even exist. That's number one. And then number two is, I do think that investing in infrastructure is something that most people feel like is a role that government can play. This was a bipartisan infrastructure law, and it had a lot of popular support on both sides of the aisle. And there were, even folks who voted against the bill were then happy once it passed to champion projects in their own districts and areas and go out and be a cheerleader for the bill. And, you can be a little cynical about the political process one way or the other, but it was obvious the bill was going to pass.
Sure.
And I think that there's a lot of things that people disagree with that government should be involved in, but I think this is one of the things that people understand would be of a value that government can add to our lives at a federal or state level, not just at a local level. And also, I feel like people get a sense that, unfortunately, as a country, we may be slipping behind other countries in terms of the infrastructure that we have. And it has not, in my mind, we haven't seen a significant impact on the economy of that. We're still the largest economy in the world, but there may reach a point where failing infrastructure is going to start to limit our ability to be economically competitive. And I think if that happens, you're going to see the floodgates open in terms of some of the federal investment.
And I think there's also there's some, in my opinion, change management needs to happen about how to even operate a water utility. I mean, Isaac, we say all the time that the majority of our water systems have 3 or fewer employees. And while we've just been talking about how utilities are in the business of producing water, those employees are also in the business of serving their municipality, going to their parks, taking care of their community assets, not just their water. And so I feel like until we, as an industry and communities, start to optimize these water systems like businesses and understand what investment looks like, what positive investment looks like in your community and in your water system versus I'm going to take this $1 million check, give it to my engineering buddy, let him over engineer whatever assets I presumably need and then go back to the well and be in the same, situation 10 years from now. We need to be in the business of building resilient communities. And I definitely think there's like an education layer of what does that mean to operate a utility in this day and age? And I don't know. I mean, I think it's a multi-pronged approach, faceted approach, but I do think, we need to understand what that layer looks like if we're going to start advocating for a substantial amount of funding coming to.
And there's an aspect of helping people understand the cost of not doing something. And I think kind of one of the points that you were making earlier was hitting on we almost need a handful more of disasters when it comes to asset failure to start motivating the
cost of inaction.
Understanding. And I think that one of the things in the bipartisan infrastructure law or IIJA, I think there was a mentality that a lot of that funding got sucked up by larger communities. And I think an asset data platform-based funding model would show that it's more ubiquitous and more that would actually go to help communities of all sizes, particularly rural water.
Let's we'll give you this, but let's help you be more predictive and smart about tracking your assets over time and the likelihood of failure versus, oh no, now we're in a catastrophe scenario and it's going to cost us 10 times as much to fix it.
And being able to be realistic about rate cases. I think that's part of it, is like understanding what should we set rates to be? That way we can actually say, what do we need supplemented? But again, I'm saying a lot, assuming a lot. Tell me where I'm wrong, or tell me your perspective on that.
My perspective is we have far too many water utilities in the United States. And, these very, very small towns, there's a lot of small town pride. They don't want to give up control over the water. They're afraid if they give up control over the water supply and they want to grow, they're not going to have the water they need to grow. So they hold on to these utilities. And frankly, those construction grants in the 1970s and early 1980s basically allowed these communities that could not sustain themselves as utilities to exist as a utility because somebody paid for all the really expensive stuff. So I feel like as a country,
great point.
If we want to continue to have thousands upon thousands of small town water utilities, we have to commit to understand, if they have 150 connections, they can't take out a loan for $4 million. It's just going to be too much on top of their day-to-day operations. So we need to find a way to consolidate systems, or, and I get dirty looks when I say this, privatize some of the systems, go to this like private, aggregator model that there are multiple of these larger investor-owned utilities that they basically buy up a bunch of systems and operate them as a single utility entity, even though they're not physically tied together. Or we need to commit to saying, yes, we're going to continue to pump grant dollars into these communities. Right now, we're kind of doing the worst of both worlds. We're creating something where these communities either have to take out a loan that they may not be able to afford or even access, or to delay a necessary capital improvement, but then not insisting when they take out that money necessarily that they look at a regional solution that would be more financially viable over the long run. And so the rates in small communities really should be significantly more than the rates in large cities, because we don't have, it's economies of scale. We don't have enough people to spread the cost out over, but there's a minimum cost of running a water utility or a wastewater utility, especially on the infrastructure side. But I think what we end up finding is that a lot of these small communities, they do enough to stay in compliance. The people who work there are wonderful, and they can manage to do a lot with a little. And I don't want to speak disparagingly of them in any way, shape, or form. They're real heroes in their communities, but they're keeping the utility like just going.
Right.
And they're all one natural disaster or public health crisis away from a really big
lots of
problem.
Single points of failure.
Right.
For
yeah. Well, and we've had others on the podcast as well, speaking to regionalization and commercialization or privatization and regionalization. And there's a notion that I've heard more consistently, and I don't know if it's because we've talked about it on the podcast or maybe it's just coming up in practice, where maybe not the entirety of the utility is consolidated, but operational pieces. So, if I'm in a region with a shared, water source and, chemistry profile or so on and so forth, it may make sense, or rate base, it may make sense to consolidate rate base operations, but yet leave certain spokes of the utility intact, so not to lose, full control to a private entity or, third party. What is your take on that strategy, Glenn? And where do you think that has any legs to stand on?
I think we see a lot of this already happening, at small communities. sometimes are contracting with operators. So one operator may end up serving 3 or 4 communities. Let's say there are, like they have their own business and they go around, they're being contracted out. That is in some ways a form of regionalization, even though those individual utilities don't have a relationship with each other. They all have a relationship with the same contract operator.
Yeah.
We do see that kind of shared sources or shared infrastructure. I think there's a lot of models that could work. I don't want to be, I'm being a little glib here, but I do think that there's been research like Manny Teodoro, who's a great thought leader in our sector, has said, if a utility is serving under 20,000 people, it's going to really struggle to be financially viable. That's one measurement. There are others have come up with other numbers. But again, in the long term, can a community of 300 or 400 people be viable without grants? I think it would be very, very difficult. And I think, though, we're nervous to talk about consolidation, and we're nervous to talk about pushing consolidation, not even forcing it, but even pushing it, in some cases, because it does feel like, well, these are independent small communities and people have a lot of identity in that community, and they don't want a state or federal government coming in and saying you have to give up a piece of that. But I don't know that the decisions are always made with either public health or good business sense as the top priority.
Yeah. Gosh, this is very thought-provoking.
It is. And it is that delineation between making pushes for what just makes sense and also ensuring it's not received as a personal attack. Like it's not that you're inadequate. It's that the system is not set up to be sustainable.
To help you succeed. Yeah. This is wonderful. Well, I think we definitely want to let people know, Glenn, where they can find you, both if they need your assistance, but also just generally where you are. But first, there's got to be a story to that giraffe that I'm staring at and have been staring at for the last 30 minutes.
Yes, there is, of course, a story about the wicker giraffe, and thank you for asking that. So when my wife and I bought this house that we're living in now for almost 20 years ago, it'll be 20 years this summer, and I think our respective families were quite excited that we had become homeowners, because this was an opportunity for them to offload the things of our childhood that they were holding on to at their homes. And so my in-laws came down with some of my wife's things, and they brought this giraffe, which I'm not convinced was one of her things, but they thought that we would like it. And so it sat in the corner of this guest room for many years. And then in the early days of the pandemic, when we started doing everything by video call, Zoom and Teams, Tara suggested to me that I stick the giraffe behind me and just not say anything about it and just leave it there. So I did. And it ironically has become a little bit of our trademark of having this mid-century wicker giraffe sitting behind me. So a couple of years ago, I started working with a wonderful colleague who's now our associate director, Alora Arnett, but she initially was part-time with us while she was still working for a water utility. And I had said to Alora, if you become full-time, I'm going to get you one of these giraffes. And so when she became our associate director almost 2 years ago, I said, okay, I've made a promise that I'm going to get a giraffe. Now I have to find one. Well, I mean, these were like mid 20th century made. So I had to search high and low, but finally found one and had it shipped to her. And I texted her and I said, okay, you're going to get a delivery today, make sure you're there for it. And she just texted me back after it arrived and just said, I cannot stop laughing at this thing. And just picture of like her little daughter who was very young at the time, not even a year, like on the back of the giraffe. So Yeah, so we've got our little wicker giraffe here, and you can also see, by the way, over my other shoulder is our CEO is sleeping on the bed.
Yes.
Oh, I love it. It's a good disarming way to start any conversation about water finance. And hey, let's talk about water rates.
But first, have you met my little friend?
First, a mid-century wicker giraffe, and it's actually a planter. Is what it really is. There's a space in the back where you would put a potted plant.
Oh, that's amazing.
Wow, that is amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. So where can people find more of you, follow your work, know where you're traveling next to? I think you're traveling from the next 2 months. You're on the road speaking and doing a lot of work. So where can people find you?
Our website, waterfinanceassistance.com, has information about all the services that we provide. I mean, we obviously work with utilities on money problems. That's a big deal, as we've been talking about today. We also, through Allura, work with utility on people problems. So she's a former HR director and customer service director for utilities. And really, I think those are the two big areas that I've seen a lot of need on. And as somebody who is not a technical expert, or areas where I feel like we can make a difference in the water sector. So our website has a good explanation of the types of work that we can do, as well as updates on some of our current projects. We've been doing a lot on making good charts and graphs and explaining all this complicated analyses to people. So that's a whole other conversation we could have that I think is great. And then beyond that, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. And so anybody who's listening, if you don't follow me or not connected with me on LinkedIn, please reach out. Would love to connect with you. And I'm posting pretty regularly on there about our work and our travels, but also the some information about water finance that is in the news around the country.
I love it. Well, thank you so much. This has been so great. And thank you to everyone who tuned in to this conversation. We love getting to have conversations like this with folks like Glenn. And so if you've enjoyed this episode, please like, share, follow, comment. Let us know who you would love to hear from, someone who makes water work, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to the Make Water Work podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a conversation. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. Connect with us on LinkedIn or send us a message. Together, we can make water work for everyone.